I just got the green light from our Laura behind the scenes here. So yeah, let's get started. Thank you everybody for attending. I think this is going to be a very illuminating session, and I'm excited that you guys are all here. So like I was saying earlier, for those that are just joining, a couple of housekeeping items. You guys will all be on mute throughout the presentation. And so if you want to communicate with us, do that in the chat. If you want to ask a question, do it in the Q&A section only. All right, I think we can go ahead with the slides. I first would like to thank our sponsors of this specific event. Thank you to Brian and everybody at TWO. You guys are super generous and wonderful. And can I put out a quick shout out to charity, which is coming up in November, so get ready. And thank you so much, One Workplace. You guys are amazing, and the support we are so thankful for the support. Thank you. And O+A, we had to support this because we believe so much in this presenter and what she has to say. Thank you. And of course, we need to do a shout out to all of our sponsors. We've got our platinum, gold, silver, bronze, nickel, and design sponsors. Thank you guys so much. We are a community, and we are you, and together we are IIDA, and we're an amazing chapter, and we're gonna get a lot done this year, even with all this crazy stuff that's happening. All right, it feels very weird thanking myself so many times, but here we go. Okay, this is an incredible committee. I can't believe how hardworking you guys all are. And this committee started actually, it was formed in the summer, just after the murder of George Floyd and the events that led to mass protests and a resurgence of the Black Lives Movement. And we pivoted very quickly to create this committee to support our community. And these guys are great. Lisa Way, Dekise May, Veronica, who's taking notes and minutes and keeping us organized with our agenda. Sean McLean, who is leaving us soon. Laura Taylor, who's right now behind the scenes running everything. And of course, our fearless leader, our president, Yoko Ishihara. Thank you guys so much. And we are also super grateful to Southern California IIDA because we're working in concert to put together some events. And if you guys, we did an event in August where it was our first program, and it's still available on the website, where we shared 4 different perspectives and personal stories of designers here in the Bay Area. And Southern California then did an event in September. It was more of a roundtable event, super interactive. You guys experienced it. It was really great, and it really did feel like we were part of a community and in a room together answering these questions and responding and working our way towards some understanding. So I'm excited to continue to work with the Southern California IIDA chapter. All right, I think I can introduce our guest now. Yes, okay. So like I said, we had our first program back in August with personal stories. And today the committee felt that we needed to back up a little bit. Part of this process we're realizing is just understanding so that we can sit with it inwardly first. So kind of like a meditation or like a brewing of sorts. And then we can outwardly start to have dialogue and conversation. And so we felt like this is where we needed to start. It's a process, and one where we need to recognize that we need to recognize and build on and address every single day. And we think that this speaker today will help us understand the multitude of dynamics that are at play, She'll help us define terms, learn how to question the bias and racism we witness and experience all around us, and provide strategies on how to address these and more, and also to move forward. Alexis Goggans is an equitable decarbonization practitioner. I love that. Facilitator and accredited executive coach. Alexis helps change agents and social impact organizations realize their bold vision for a better world. She leverages systems thinking and strategy to help individuals and organizations equitably implement climate, sustainability, and social impact initiatives. And this is where I found her so interesting, is that she's coming at it from a multifaceted angle, not just from a single lens. And so I think this is what I hope you will also find quite interesting. She believes that creating a better world requires bold new ways of living, working, and leading. I couldn't agree with her more. We are living in an incredible moment in history. Let's not waste this opportunity. Now is the time to ask questions, to just challenge the status quo, and use our power as designers to disrupt what needs disrupting through design, however we can do it. We all have a lot of work to do. With that, I would like to welcome Alexis. Alexis, please take it away. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone out there. Thank you for this warm introduction. I love this expression of gratitude at the beginning. We don't always give enough gratitude for everyone today for the work that's happening, but so grateful to be here with you all, even virtually. I'm going to try. I'm a super interactive person, as Verda shared, so I'll try to light it up in the chat and yeah, spend some time looking at everyone's name and witnessing you all, but just really appreciate that you all took some time out of your lives during this moment of moments to be here on something that's so important and dear to my heart. And I'm always trying to understand, who's out there, who are you, what brought you here? And so I just want to pause and give you all a moment to introduce yourself in the chat box. You should be able to see it on the very, very bottom of your screen, and it will light up as folks share who they are, but I would love for you to introduce yourself. Maybe you want to shout out your organization, and maybe you have a question or a curiosity that you brought with you today. So feel free to drop those in the chat. And while that happens, I just want to give a shout out to a couple of folks who introduced themselves. We've got Christine Peter, who's here. We've got a couple of folks from Orange County. Hello, Adam, Sonia, so great to see you all here. Oh my gosh, we've got some folks from IIDA in Northland and Minnesota. Sarah, welcome. Welcome, Sarah, from Minneapolis. Carrie from Malum Architects. Apologies if I'm not saying that correctly. Out in Seattle, we've got folks from North Carolina. Bonnalie Perry, welcome, welcome. Got some folks from the Bay Area thinking about how do we use food as a resource for social change, big questions. Got some grad students. Hey, Shelly. Roxy from Los Angeles, that's where my family's at. Sending you a warm, warm welcome. Hey, Bridget, Cheryl, so wonderful to see. Hey, Lisa, I know you, Lisa, I see you. Shout out to Studio O+A for bringing me in. So great to have worked with your staff and so excited to be with you all. So please continue to tell us who you are, what brought you here, any questions or curiosities you're holding. And I'm going to look forward to sharing some thoughts with you all and touching base later when we go into Q&A. So yeah, thank you all for this. And I've always tried, Zoom, my business before was, a virtual business. So I've always kind of been thinking about, how do we create engaging spaces? And now the whole world, it seems, and many people who are working from home now are, just asking deep questions about equity and what it means to show up in this moment. So we're really curious to see, where are you and your organization at with equity? So we've got 3 questions for a poll. And I'm hoping that we will see it pop up on our screen for our first question here. Hopefully you all are seeing this on your screen. For folks who are on the phone, you will not be able to participate in the poll. However, we will share the results with you verbally. So for everyone else, you should be able to see our first question up on your screen. How would you describe your understanding of racial, economic, and gender equity? Are you a beginner? Are you a novice? Are you someone who can easily talk about concepts? you consider yourself advanced. Would love to know where everyone is at. So please go ahead and vote using the buttons on your Zoom panel, and we'll be able to share the results here after we just give it a few moments for folks to share their responses. All right, so we've got our results for our first poll here. All right, so 61% of you all say that you're intermediate. You can define equity, discuss concepts, and what equity looks like in practice. Okay, shout out to a couple of the folks who are novice and just joining here, and this is our first journey. We welcome you, we're celebrating you joining us with this journey. And got, okay, 14 folks are intermediate. We've got some experts here. Maybe an expert. All right, expert, please drop your knowledge in chat and share, but welcome to all of you. And great way to just test with the idea that hopefully in a year from now, if you're on this journey, you'll be able to kind of expand your experience. So we'll close this one and we'll launch our next question here. All right, I feel confident discussing and navigating situations that have to do with racial, social, and gender equity. Such an important question here. Oftentimes we may know why it's important, but being able to talk about it, articulate it, even show up in those situations is so important. So let us know, do you agree with this statement? Do you disagree? Where are you at? Love to hear from you all. In my head, there's Jeopardy music playing. I can't see you guys' faces, but there's Jeopardy music playing. So hope you are laughing with me. But yeah, let's see if we can get everyone to respond here before we close. All right, we'll share results here. All right, so 67% of you all say that you somewhat agree, that you feel confident discussing and navigating situations. We've got 20% saying they strongly agree. A couple of folks disagreeing, a couple of people not sure. But this is great. I'm hoping that this will help give you some language and give you some of that confidence and willingness to talk and have these conversations. So we'll close this one and open up our last poll. All right, how do you feel your organization is doing at integrating equity in your workplace? So this is obviously your thoughts and feelings, but we want to hear about it, especially as you all as designers have the opportunity to do tremendous work for your industry and sector. So let us know, how do you think your org is doing integrating equity into the workplace? And hopefully if they're not doing too good, you're holding space and you can also be a champion for that work. So let us know, drop your responses here in the poll and we'll share results here very soon. Last call, get it in. All right, let's share our results here. Okay, 67% reasonably well. Okay. Ooh, 7 folks saying not good at all. A couple of folks saying great. My hope is that once you get even more insight and knowledge, you'll be like, actually, our organization can be doing lots of different things. So just reminding that this is a personal journey, but also an organizational journey. So really excited that you all are thinking deeply individually about yourself and how your orgs are showing up, and excited to share the work that we're going through today. So these are some of the learning opportunities. I'm not going to spend a lot on this slide, but I just want to kind of ground our conversation today. Getting that really basic understanding. What do we mean when we talk about justice, equity, diversity, inclusion? And then how do we grapple with things like bias, oppression, socialization, and what do all those mean when we think about systemic oppression? And I studied history, mostly looking at colonization and looking at early environmental history of the Americas. And so I do a lot of work at thinking about the long-term impacts of oppression. We'll talk about that. And then I'll shift and talk a little bit about what does it mean to show up and to think systemically, and why systems thinking, right? And what does that mean for allies? And all of this really with the hope that you can start to think really critically about JEDI. What does it mean individually for you and your organization? Because it's really complex. And sometimes when we're using buzzwords, we don't always stop to really think and understand the gravity of it. So These are the opportunities and offerings for you all. And I'll say this is typically like a 6-hour, 3-part series. There's a lot of information, but really hoping that this last part is just a teaser to help you start and help hold more space within yourself to think critically about some of these issues. All right, so here we go, JEDI 101, a basic introduction. And I'll say too, I am a belonging practitioner. Most of the work that I've done has been rooted in equity and very intersectional, but a lot of people have been asking about justice and what it means. And so this is something that I've shared and wanted to share and offer to you all and just really provide some super common language to ground us all. So justice, this idea that there's a maintenance or administration of what we say is just, which is fair and right? And especially if it's impartial, right? So that there's law and that there's a sense of what is true and fair, right? And then equity is something that people have also been talking about, right? Fairness in access, quality, process, and outcomes. And this is so critical, especially when we're talking about people who are historically oppressed and underserved. We'll talk about a little bit about what some of those terms mean. And then diversity. This is something that I feel like when companies started to really get into, human resources and hiring, diversity hiring was a really kind of big buzzword. And so this is really when we're talking about, is the group that we're looking at really representative of the society in which it exists and operates, right? So if you all are designers, right, is the design profession reflective of the larger population that it serves? And then this idea of inclusion, right? Is how do we have this practice of inviting people and making sure that they're accommodated, especially for people who, because of their ability or gender preferences or even their race, right? To make sure that they're invited in. And I do a lot of belonging work, which is another step that we'll talk with later in the presentation, right? Is making sure that we're not just including people, but that they have a sense of belonging, right? I belong here. I feel like this is my place. And I want to pause too. I had a really great opportunity to speak with Yoko, and she shared with me that one of her colleagues, Rosa Shang, who's with the Smith Group, had coined this term JEDI architecture. There's a great article that's online, and I myself want to dig into it, but I love that I get to learn from you all. It's actually one of the things that I love most about my work. I'm always evolving as well. And this idea that justice has to come before we start to answer questions about equity, diversity, and inclusion. But a really great offering. There's so many thought leaders who are taking the lead in this work from Rosa being back from 2017. So I want to invite you all to definitely check out her work and also to think deeply too about what some of these phrases mean to you and some of the other thought leaders who are out there. So definitely want to give a shout out to you all. And I will say too, when I started doing research for some of this presentation, the design world had so much great, powerful language and visuals. So it was a real great opportunity for me to learn about how you all are approaching this as well. And I always have to remind people, we throw out terms, we talk about terms, but it really is kind of this spectrum, right, of practice of social change, right? We have to think about, this is really kind of like an approach. And there's all these approaches that have evolved and they're still evolving, right? And so I created this chart, and this is a great thing for, you could share the link to the chart later, but this is a great thing for you, for when you're talking with your organization, to think about, where do you fall, right? Where's the appetite that you have? On the one hand, right, if we think about things that are more conservative or more change-oriented, we've got tolerance, right? So if you think, don't ask, don't tell policy, right? We're accepting all people and beliefs, but we're really working to end harassment and hate, right? And so this is directly about addressing violence and forms of abuse. And then you start to move up the spectrum, and then we start to have terms like equality, right? So making sure everyone's created equal, focusing on universal needs, and moving up to inclusion, which we talked about on the previous slide, removing cultural and physical barriers to access, right? Respect for diverse identities and beliefs. And then as you move up, you get to equity, and we talk about access, right? So now we're talking about access, but also addressing power dynamics. Right? Are you having fair representation in your decision-making process, right? Is there equal opportunity, right, for people to participate? And then we have justice, right? Building power, and we start to talk about accountability and things like privilege. And then you move up towards liberation and restorative justice. And this isn't exhaustive by any means, right? You could kind of put belonging in here. Maybe it falls a little bit between inclusion and equity. maybe even actually past restorative justice, you would have regenerative culture, right? Not the idea that we just want to restore and rebuild, right? And work towards repair, but that we want to give back more. And I would say for myself, that's something I really want to bring into my work, is how do we give back more, right? But this is a great spectrum, and I think it's helpful for you all to think, yeah, where does our org fit? With the idea that ideally as you start learning more, you will mature, your learning will mature, and maybe your appetite and willingness to do the work will mature. So maybe you'll start off doing some equality work, some inclusion work, and then in a few years, you're having conversations with your stakeholders, with your clients, right? With your staff about what does it mean to bring liberation into our equity work. So just an offering here for you all to ask this question. And I think what I'm trying to get at is that it's not just about kind of, what's our spectrum, where are we at, but really when we think about use case, right? It helps us to inform how we want to show up in the world, right? So I have this graphic here that I pulled from Angus McGuire, and you all can use this as long as you photo credit Angus. There's a great information page online if you Google the name. But if we just think about what do these spectrums look like in practice, right? They actually can lead to very different results. So you can have equality, and in this case, there's this fictional baseball game, and some groups said, okay, we want to make sure that people who can't get in can still see, so we're going to give them boxes, and we're going to give everyone the same box, right? We can see, right? Not everyone's having the same experience. And then as we move towards equity, we can say, okay, we're actually going to give the resources according to need, right? And so there's this idea of fairness, right? To each according to their need. And then as we move towards liberation, which is the area I'm most excited about, what if we just removed the wall and we don't need the boxes, and we've taken all of these barriers that prevent us from all having and being able to experience whatever we want in the way that we need. And so this is really helpful when we think about the spectrum. It's not just using words, it's actually like, great, that will inform your approach and how you're showing up in the world. But that's not enough, right? Maybe you can say with your organization, okay, we're thinking about equity, but it doesn't always complete a very big picture, right? And so I always ask, okay, if we're thinking about this use case, what's not pictured here? What's missing? So say we take equity work, which is kind of the center of the work that I do. You can see, okay, we understand they've distributed some of the resources out. People can, they're obviously enjoying themselves at the game. But there's so much here, right, that we can't see, right? So I ask a lot of questions like, who constructed this wall in the first place? Was it a corporate billionaire? Was it a community project? Is this an old historic fence? Who put the wall up, right? But what about the policies, right? Were there policies or practices or initiatives that permitted construction of this wall here, right? Who did that? And then even if we think about, say some, design team came in and they have the solution, right? Are these resources really distributed fairly, or are they sufficient? I mean, are these kind of like cheap IKEA boxes that might, cause cancer, or, I don't want to put IKEA under the bus, but, just really as an example, right? Are these going to cause harm? Are these the good boxes? Was this the last resort, right? We don't know. Or what about stakeholders, right? Did we actually talk to the people in the audience and say, how do you feel about these boxes? Do you like these boxes? Were these boxes selected as part of a really intentional community engagement process? And then what about the attendees, right? Do they actually feel supportive? Is everyone like excited about the investment? Do they all show up on opening day, right? Do they feel welcomed? Do they feel safe that's there? And I always think about, right? Was this sustainable, right? And impactful, right? Did we source these boxes locally from, wood from an old barn, or did we ship them from, Europe, right? And so there's all of this unpacking that we can do with equity. And for you all as designers, right? You might be asking, well, is this design intervention actually going to lead to an improved use of space, right? People can't move between these boxes, right? Are they toppling over when people are getting off? How do they get on and off the boxes? Is that safe? Is this ADA compliant? More questions and unpacking, more questions and unpacking. And I would love, because this is typically when I stop my presentation, I'm going to pull up the chat box. I'd love to hear how all of this is sitting with you all. We can see, right, that equity is a little bit more complex than we want to make it on the surface. And so what this for me has really taught is that This makes inequality and solving equity issues super, super pervasive, meaning it's something that is really hard to put our finger on, and it's kind of everywhere and nowhere all at the same time. So really, really difficult. And I think one of the hardest things is that even when we make decisions, right, sometimes we're unknowingly, right, perpetuating bias because we just don't know what we don't know. And so one of the things that I'm always telling people is that we have to think about bias. Oop, it's not letting me click. There we go. If we're thinking around our natural automatic inclination or our temperament, or even kind of bias in the connection between privilege, right? Like we're actually bringing in stereotypes that are unfounded, judgments that we're projecting on individuals or groups, is that we can see them show up both implicitly and also explicitly, right? And the implicit is the unconscious, right? It's unconscious, it's kind of implied, but it's not really said. And so you could think about, there was this great article that was done about job seekers who were whitening their names because they realized that people were just passing their names on the resumes. Maybe that was explicit, but maybe the person who was viewing just subconsciously tapped into a different piece there and passed on the resume, right? Same thing with mortgage applications. We see this all the time. And then with explicit bias, those are things that are conscious and observable. There's a sign that says, we don't want any, people here who don't own land, or this is a colored only entrance or a white only space, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's easy for us to point out things that say, that's wrong, that's biased. But so much of the stuff that happens is actually implicit, it's implied, it's subconscious, it's unconscious. We don't always know that we're doing it. And that's where we create, I think, a lot of the majority of harm. And I think what takes us even further is that bias, right, is systemic. So it's not just our individual experience. We see it culturally. If we're going to the movie, we see language that's used, music, commercials. We see it all the time, and it's so subtle. We also have our own internal bias, right? As a Black woman, I have had to go back through and kind of unlearn some of the things that have caused me harm, right? Or not even harm, but things that just actually didn't really reflect the true complexity of society and history. And so sometimes we also adopt bias, and it can be even against ourselves, a form of internalized oppression. And you kind of move up this ladder, right? And then you see how bias works out in interactions with people, and even in structures when we're making decisions, and even in our government or our schools, our institutions, right? The organizations that are holding kind of the way our society moves and operates. And if we think about implicit to explicit, it's kind of, again, a spectrum, right? When we think about cultural and our personal experience with bias, right? It's kind of implicit. It's kind of, we can feel it. It's hard to put our finger on it or to name it. And it's also more qualitative, right? So it's more feelings, more rather than data. And then as you move up, we start to move towards more explicitity, right? When we're working with others, when we're making decisions, it's kind of a mix of explicit and implicit. We can be in a space and we can say, oh, okay, there's some people of color here, right? But we don't know, right, if the people feel welcome, right? Or if there are people who identify as disabled or as transgender, right? Do they actually feel welcome in the space, even if we can count and say, oh, okay, we've got the numbers, this is representative of the population. So it's kind of a mix. And then as you go into institutions, it's really easy to say, okay, this policy led to, this adverse effect for this population, and we can quantify it and we can make a chart, and it's really easy for us to see that. So what does our mind do? It goes straight to the explicit piece, and it's hard for us to then address, unearth, and start to unpack where a lot of that hurt and harm and trauma and tension comes from, which is really that implicit bias, the things that are unconscious that we do. And I am always fascinated by this, because this is really so indicative of our worldviews, right? What we're bringing to the space, our understanding of our identity, and how it informs the way that we see the world, right? I love this graphic. It's from Lane Community College. Had this on their website, and I was reading through something. I said, oh, I love this. It's so great. So this is adapted here, but just to kind of break down, right? It's super complex, again, a lot of complexity. But we have primary, secondary, organizational, and cultural identity, right? And all we have here is we can see that bias kind of fits in and is influenced by all these identities. We're all biased. And so you have primary identities. These are things that we can't change. We're born with them, or we can't change them. Our gender, our sexual orientation, our physical ability, our race or ethnicity, right? These are things that we're kind of born with. And then as you move out and you go to secondary, there's things like your habits, your language, your income, your religion, right? Those are things that inform your identity, but they might change. They're a little bit more fluid. And then so on and so forth to your organizational identity. Are you a manager? Are you a supervisor? Are you a volunteer? And then cultural, right? And these are the layers of identity. Identity is super complex, right? Anytime there's an aspect of a person or community that might define or allow them to be part of a group or membership, right? That's kind of how we define identity. And we also have to understand this idea intersectionality, which I'm sure many of you all have heard about. Okay, if you haven't, but this idea that there's a person who can bring one or more different identities or experiences together. And often that the intersection of all those identities, right, means that they face even different types of circumstances or limitations or oppression. And we all, right, have different identities. So we're all complex people. And the idea with intersectionality is that we can name that we are complex human beings and that we need to think about the intersection of identities and the lived experience of people, especially people who are oppressed. And we'll talk a little bit about that. So I have this question, identities themselves aren't bad, right? It's great to celebrate your culture, your history, your sense of self, but they can also be a source of harm. And so I have this question, how does identities and worldviews, how do they create harm? And this concept of othering is really big. John Powell, who I'm a super fan of, is doing fantastic work in California at Berkeley, talks about othering. He says, othering is a generalized set of common processes that deny someone's full humanity based on them just being less than or threat than whatever the favored or dominant group is, right? And we see this all the time. We see this in history where people tried to say, hey, you know what? Black people actually are a totally different race, right? There's different distinctions of mankind. Obviously, science, we know that there's more genetic variation amongst people within what we would call distinct racial ethnic groups than there is across, right? But this idea that it can be used as a kind of a tool to create harm. We also see this when we talk about things like religious rights and those who identify as transgender, right? Othering, right? Saying like, oh, it's actually you're less than, or you're a threat to maybe a religious belief, right? And so this is a map showing anti-LGBT legislation in different states. And so you can kind of get a sense, and I think this is from maybe 4 years ago. So this is now where there's places where you can still have, religious refusal, or they can promote conversion therapy. And this is a really, really big sense of harm. And so mental models is really the piece here that's so important. I, as someone who is very much interested in consciousness studies and, our perspectives and how they shape how we show up in the world, understand how much and how important they are. And othering is something that can be used to kind of dominate these, to perpetuate this idea that there's mental models that are better, or worldviews that are better, more valid, more effective, more whatever. And mental models or worldviews are really just our habits of thought, right? They're the beliefs, the assumptions, the things that we do and say just naturally, right? Without even really thinking about it. And they're kind of taken for granted. And we see this all the time, right? It's kind of really subtle, but we have these mental models that we cling on to, and sometimes we don't get to go, oh, wait, this actually is kind of toxic and not okay, right? I pull this picture up here of the adopters of the Constitution. They're here in Pennsylvania, and they're getting ready to sign Constitution. They have taken this democracy idea from the Iroquois Confederacy, and at the same time, many of these people own slaves, right? They also later in subsequent years were responsible, our legislative leaders, for taking Native Indigenous children away from their homes to raise them up in Christian and largely white households, right? And we also even see it in just commercials and TV, right? These are some ads from, I believe, the 50s or 60s. And it's pretty toxic, right? But these ran in print, right? I'm sure people were like, doesn't really feel okay. But this idea, right? We see it in so many different ways, right? That we're othering people, or we're saying that like, hey, this is actually like okay to treat women this way, that women are wives, right? Not to mention, there's no people of color in this picture, right? We don't have, there's all sorts of unpacking that we can do here. But mental models are really important, right? And the issue is when they're used as tools of oppression, right, to other people. And so that's where we kind of get this concept of privilege, right? Where we have power by a member of one worldview that's kind of dominant or adopted, right? And the power that they use to wield influence, right, is what creates oppression. And on the other side is privilege. The more oppression that's created, the more privilege members of the dominant worldview actually experience. And so this is a definition of oppression here, but this idea that this systemic and institutional abuse of power by one group, right, at the expense of another. And not just at the expense of another, but that force is actually used to maintain this dynamic, right? It's an active process, right? And privilege, right, means that on the other side of this is that an advantage is then given or conferred to another group at the expense. We see this all the time. This is probably something that feels a little bit more real and present for us, right? There's a sign. I want to say that this is from the 20s. I will have to check on that. But look at this. Christians only, Jews not allowed. Oppression, right? Explicit, right in front of our eyes. Here's a picture as well. Let's see here. I'm going to go with 1913, 1912 women's suffrage movement. So early 1900s here. Look at this, headquarters, National Association Opposed to Women's Suffrage. Just like you all as an association are organizing, right? We've got groups that are coming together to actively oppress, right, other groups. We see this with racial gerrymandering. This is an example of North Carolina. I believe this is from the 2016 elections. So you can see here just outright oppression, right? Look at these maps here, right? Again, privilege being given to one party over another, and obviously favoring and providing privileges to another group. So these are just some examples, right? And then today, right, we see this real life happening, right, with police, right? This idea that we should listen to police and they know what's best and they maintain order, right? And they have power, right? And we all get kind of wrapped up in that power struggle. So we're seeing this real life oppression play out right now. And one of the things that I've always tried to articulate in my work, not to confuse people, but to invite them to think about how complicated everything is. Not because we need to get wrapped up in the complication, but to understand how complex this is and to hold that complexity. And I absolutely love this chart. This is an intersecting axis of privilege, domination, and oppression. Because I think sometimes we think, oh, well, just because I'm, a woman or white or, whatever said identity, you may not feel like you experience oppression, but there's so many identities here, right? And so, me as an African-American woman, maybe I'm not being conferred the same privileges as someone who's maybe white or has skin privilege, has white skin privilege, but I also speak English, right? I also graduated from college and I have a degree. So I also have privilege as well, right? Within and across all of my identities. I identify as cisgender, so I identify with the sex that I was given at birth, right? So I have privilege in that as well, right? So it's really an axis, and you can kind of see all of these different power axes that we see expressed in society. And I encourage and invite you all to think about your, right, axis of privilege, right? Where do you stand? Where do you stack up? And this is a self-reflective exercise, right? Not meant to shame or anything, but for you to go, wow, I never thought about even being young is a privilege, right? Being able-bodied, being healthy, all of these pieces. So really an unpacking. And so if we're thinking about dominant worldviews and oppression, I'm always wondering, how does this happen, right? What are the tools of oppression? How does this happen? It feels so slight, but it's actually really easy to kind of pinpoint. So a dominant worldview is just any type of worldview that's been normalized, right? And typically that's through violence, assimilation, conditioning, and socialization. Those are kind of like the four tools that we see. And then, of course, as we have other worldviews and identities that are marginalized, they're erased, right? They're censored, they're taken out of history, they don't have platforms. This is oppression, right? This is one of the manifestations of oppression here. So critical. And I see Adam from the chat saying this is so helpful. I'd love, please share with me your thoughts. I really want to know how this is landing with you all. So continue to please share your insights, questions, and thoughts here. Appreciate you, Adam, dropping in a note here. So I feel engaged. And Shelley, appreciate that too, that this is really thought-provoking. So keep asking these questions. I think if anything, I hope that people can ask questions, especially when we get to this question we have around, what do we mean when we say white dominant culture? And I'm still trying to find my language as a practitioner. You'll hear people say like white supremacy or American culture. I'm not really attached to the words, but I do want to name that white dominant culture isn't just about racism. It's so many other things. When we think about mental models, right? We see racism, right? Othering based on skin privilege. We also see paternalism, sometimes called authoritarianism, the idea that there's a man or a father figure that has kind of the right to do work. We see capitalism also being a tool of oppression, right? Extractive culture, winners and losers. And then something people don't talk about a lot, but I, as someone who does a lot of work in spiritual ecology and deep ecology, how can we be connected and understand actually the ecosystem of the earth, is mechanistic thinking, right? The idea that humans or organizations are machines, that things are linear. And this is an old inheritance from Newton in physics and the scientific revolution that thought there was determinism and we could just plot out the whole universe and everything had order and structure, right? These are some of the co-conspirators of white dominant culture. And so what this actually looks like in practice, right, is that you have these mental models or worldviews, right? So racism, paternalism, mechanistic thinking, capitalism. And then we have all these norms or socially accepted behaviors and beliefs. And I'm not going to be able to go into this a lot because of time. There's two articles here that are so great. There's an article on white dominance culture and characteristics of white supremacy culture, which I used and adapted. There's not a lot of people talking about mechanism in this work, but I do a lot of geek out science stuff on consciousness studies and the true nature of reality, which is a whole other webinar. But I want you all to think about these norms that show up, right? We're talking about racism, individualism, the rugged individual identity, brighter is better, saviorism, othering, paternalism, power hoarding, keeping tabs on people, stay in your lane, rational over emotional. And then we think about the mechanistic thinking, right? We talked about this objectivity and order, perfectionism, linear thinking, shiny and new, right? And then you all know capitalism, right? Competition, scarcity mindset, transactional, extractive, growth at any cost, right? These are things that are normed. And I see some folks in the chat box. We'll also be sharing some helpful links from here afterwards as well. So trust that you'll be able to see all of this. And yeah, so things like environmental racism, right? It's drawing on all of these different worldviews, right? Super, super helpful for us to think about. And I want to give you all a tip because some people say, well, white dominant culture, I mean, it's kind of all the tools we have and it's kind of the culture that I'm used to operating. So what do we do? And I say, okay, white dominant culture is problematic when it creates harm or it's used as a tool of oppression, right? And some people say whiteness isn't like a culture, but just these mental models, right? They're not helpful when they create oppression. If somebody stabs you or you have a heart attack, you want to better believe that somebody who believes in order and linear thinking as a surgeon is going to save your life. These are skills, they're archetypes that are available to us as humans, right? But when they create harm, they're not helpful. So sometimes it's nice to have structure when you're in a meeting. I love a structured meeting. Studio A will tell you, I will have an agenda for every meeting, right? But if it doesn't serve and people aren't feeling good about it, then it's a form of oppression. So I think that's a really important fact that I want to share with you all. And a common question that kind of comes up. So I'm going to pause there because I'm feeling a little pressured on time. And every time I get to that slide, it's almost a relief. You know, I don't know why I was really anxious for this. You know, this is an anxious time for a lot of people. There's a lot of grieving. And every time I do this presentation, I myself build a little bit more resilience to push back against, you know, oppressive American culture. And so I'm going to pause right now. And I want to invite you all to pause with me. This is so much information. But please continue to share your thoughts in the chat. Carrie, really appreciate that this is deepening some of the other presentations that you're seeing. Thank you. Please share your thoughts and reflections. Maybe even just take a moment while I'm still feeling the tension of time to just sit with this. This is a lot of unpacking. Don't want you to get overwhelmed. Again, the whole goal is to just start to think a little bit more critically around what equity and diversity means, right? Thank you, Kat, for your affirmation. I bet you're doing an amazing job in your life too, showing up. So thank you all for this chat, love. Feeling more connected with you all. All right, so we're going to go on. There's going to be more complexity. We're going to expand and hold ourselves with the space. Don't get caught on the data and stuff. It's really just, I want you to ask questions and think kind of more critically about this. It's my one hope. And even just contextualizing a lot of this, you know, we become really numb to oppression. And I always wondered, you know, what is that about? This chart is here. It's the cycle of socialization. It's from Bobby Harrow's Readings for Diversity and Social Justice. You guys will know, a lot of people out here doing stuff. I don't need to recreate the wheel. I'm just a lecturer and an ideas person. I just want to share and reflect. So please go find people who you love who are using language and asking great questions. I hope this will help you to think about who those folks might be. But I love this graphic. This really shows, right, socialization in the process of what happens from the moment we're born, where we're born, we have really no guilt, no choice, right? And we inherit that first layer of identity, right? Our race, our ethnicity, our gender preference, all those things, right? We don't really get to choose. And then from that moment, we have relatives and teachers and all of these people, right, who are also giving us kind of our first round of socialization. Your religion, all of these things that you don't choose are kind of just given to you on a plate, and that's the options that you have. And then as you grow over, right, institutions, whether it's your school or churches or government or even your doctor, right, the medical industry, right, we get more of this socialization. It's only enforced, right? And I guess my point that I want to make is that white dominant culture emerged in American institutions 400 years ago. It's a lot of history. That's a lot of time for socialization to start refining systems, right? And that's actually building on a legacy of things like mechanistic thinking that existed for hundreds of years before that. There's a lot of history to unpack here. And it began at the moment of our life, and it continues to some degree, depending on our ability to push back for the rest of our lives, right? And the point here I want to make is that we are socialized to be complicit with white dominant culture. And that's because it dictates our ability to thrive and fit in, right? A great reflection here. I'm trying to be more authenticity in my work. Sometimes I really worry about how I should do my hair for webinars. I know it might sound silly, but I am so conscious of Blackness, my Blackness, and sometimes how it shows up or how people respond. And so then I want to take the edge off. I want people to see me. And so I make myself a little bit easier. And not that I don't love my hair this way, but that I have to ask myself this question because I want to fit in, because I want to get a paycheck and I want to pay off my bills and I want to take my mom out, you know, all of these things, right? So I want to remind you. And the point of this is that at the core of all of this, what keeps us in here from pushing out, right, is that we want to be connected. We want to be in community with people. And as soon as we start to break away from the system, we get fear, ignorance, confusion, right? Oh my gosh, what do I do? A lot of you might be feeling that now. Gosh, I didn't realize how bad racism was or how important it is to center, you know, transgender youth. And the body starts to react. And this is an ego response. It feels strong, but it's to keep you safe. It really is. It's to keep you safe. It's a program response. It's something that we've evolved to do depending on your, you know, belief. There's a lot of science on it and still some discussion about it, but it's an ego response. And that's what keeps us in the cycle because we want to be connected. We all want to pay off, you know, our debt or buy a house, you know, whatever. And so this is really hard. And I love this slide. I'm seeing the chat blow up. So I'm going to stop and look. Yeah, we've been segregated on purpose. Yeah, we'll talk about this. That's actually what keeps us in the system moving. So really, really appreciate this. Seeing some other people here talking about hair issues, and maybe you have your own version of how you're shaping yourself. I was joking, I won't name names, but you get on a conference call and it's like, oh, what should I wear so that they can kind of take me in? And we go through this back and forth with ourselves, and it's healthy, right? We want to fit in. We want to not offend people. We also don't want to do it because it feels awful for us. And we talked about this. This is like a whole history of harm, right? I'm not going to go into this a lot, but we just have to remember, right? There's a history of harm here, right? It's not just from our moment of birth. We're also inheriting the history of harm from being here in America. And maybe you're not necessarily an American citizen, but we're here. And so we are part of that history of harm. Laws passed, slaves brought, bounties for scalping. I encourage you all at some point when you're ready in your journey to go into the history of America. And when I say America, I mean the history of the United States. At colonial contact, America has a very rich history before, obviously, the whole continent of the Americas, before the first colonists came. So you just want to think about that, right? And now I want to talk a little bit about design, because I think the design piece is so important. We got this history of harm, but we also know that design, and you all as designers also are part of this industry that has kind of this inherited influence of creating harm in the world. And I do a lot of work in the built environment. I was somebody who was doing benchmarking for energy and water usage in buildings and LEED and all kinds of stuff. It's kind of my background in building science and urban planning. And so one of the things that I learned when I was a planner is like, we've had so many just like planning design fails. This is like millions of dollars, millions of public dollars for like, yeah, let's just try this. We're going to solve it. So I shared a picture here. This is public housing from St. Louis, Missouri. Pruitt Ego is the name. And you'll see these, there's pretty much in the, I want to say in the 60s and 70s, right? We see these really large public housing complexes go up. It was kind of like the design industry. And when I say design, I mean urban planners were like, oh yeah, let's just create huge structures with no grass or green space, totally isolate the community and put people who are oppressed all together there. And this will be great. They'll have shelter, right? So this happened, right? Millions of dollars pumped into this. They were demolished. Nobody wanted to go in and maintain the buildings, right? There were barely trees. It was a concrete jungle. There was no access to food, not transportation. We're setting up communities to experience more harm. And as designers, I'm sure some firm came in and was like, we'll have couches here and have lamps here, right? And I'm making light of it, but because we have to think about the connectedness of all of our work. And we still see that today, right? I saw this picture in Target of, I guess this went viral, but we have here a child who's using a wheelchair, and they're seeing and looking at them in a Target, and they see a picture of a child in a wheelchair. And there's a video of this kid talking about how amazing it was, right? So design also is key to ensuring physical and cultural access to space, right? There's so many times where I'll go into a building and I'll look around and I go, all of the art here is like white men or white young people. And it kind of makes me a little uncomfortable until I kind of like get numb to it. And then I'm just like, and that's kind of bad too, but we have to think about space, right? This is a rendering. This is another good example from a Dayton project in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Saw some folks in the chat from Minneapolis. Wonder if you heard about this on the news, right? See if you guys can see, right? Design can tell us who does and doesn't belong in a space. So I'll give you a moment to look at this picture. Who's the space for, right? So if you are thinking maybe deeply about this, right? They got called out for it, right? Almost all white artist renderings, right? What's so funny about the headline, right? Is I was like, okay, yeah, maybe not people of color in this space, but like, are people who are older or elderly allowed to come here? What about kids, right? What about if you're disabled or you use a wheelchair, right? Or if you're blind, right? Even in this topic, right? We're missing other identities, right? But design is such a powerful story to tell. I see so many renderings and it'll be like, this is a rendering for like downtown DC. There's no people of color, no tourists, just okay. But again, implicit bias, so subtle, and some people can pick it up. I'm gonna go up into the chat here. Yeah, look at this, could reach the shelves and racks. Exactly, look at these design questions. So I want you all to think about, right, your role in harm and thinking about this work. Folks here are sharing their lived experience and living out in the South as well, and having all the different realities will hold. So appreciating you, Cheryl, for sharing. And so many of the other people, Sarah talks about some of the clients that don't want to include people in renderings anymore. So then we're kind of maybe avoiding, maybe it's a good strategy. We don't know, but yeah, it's a tension. We got to kind of figure out how to navigate it. And the other piece that I wanted to share, which is new, I know there were Studio O+A folks who had kind of a version of this presentation. But one of the things we also don't talk about, right, is even under that, we think about what's not pictured here. Is always just think about when you're going into office spaces, you know, even we can create harm in the materials we choose, right? This is from the LA, this is from the LA American Institute of Architects. They also had their own series of equity in architecture, and this is from them. But they talked about, right, is that if we're thinking about materials we're using for buildings, right, we've got to think about, like, is this toxic? Was it sourced locally? Is there a carbon emissions impact that's gonna, you know, raise emissions and, global warming and, create harm for, communities that are in other countries, who aren't even part of it? Or what about even the design for process for manufacturing, right? Were the workers paid a living wage? Do they have safe access to health? Do they have good working conditions? So many questions, right? And so it's a lot to hold, but there's also opportunities, right? These are also opportunities for you all to think really about what it means to be designers and to think about equity, to think about inclusion. Oops, clicking, there we go. And then on the other side of that, right, as people are waking up, we're starting to push back, right? It's not just the history of oppression. We also have people that are coming up and starting to say, hey, we've got to pass laws. We've got to make a change. And so there's this ongoing battle, right? Harm hasn't happened in a style. People have been standing up and disrupting and trying to imagine new ways since, I think since the beginning. I think there was always someone who was like, this isn't that right. But we need to also honor this history that we're all part of. You being on this webinar, we're part of the history of pushing back and confronting racism. But what I always struggle with, right, is despite this long history of, social justice and nonviolent civil disobedience and protest and movement, right, despite all these interventions, equity is still a huge issue. And not only that, but it's actually growing, right, and it's actually getting worse. And so I'm gonna move through some of these slides because I wanna make sure I get to the system slides. But we have the widening income gap. You can see it actually getting worse. We can see projections from wealth inequality, and those are actually getting worse as well, right? So they're projecting and saying it's actually gonna get worse, right? Despite all of the work that we're doing, all the money into all of these projects. We see it with the pandemic and racial disparity and deaths for COVID. We also see it as well in the implications for employment, right? So these are high level. But again, despite all these interventions, we're still seeing inequality happen over and over again, right? And so this is kind of this premise for systems thinking, right? Is how do we manage what I call this intent to impact gap, right? And what we're seeing is a real shift here, right? Instead of demanding better from a system that was not designed to create beautiful, wonderful, connected communities, to actually saying we actually have to transform the system, right? And this is this new paradigm. And what that means is, we want to have justice. We want to arrest, for example, here, Breonna Taylor's killers, to saying not only do we want justice, we also need to defund the police. We need to transform the system. This is not a new argument. So many people have been talking about abolition, but this shift of people understanding, right? And it's slow, and public opinion is slow to move, but it's a beautiful opportunity, right? For us to think systemically. And that's why I do systems change work. It's so complex. It's so hard for us to understand the complexity of all these ideas. So we go, oh my gosh, it's too much, it's too much. Instead of going, it's all connected. There's little pieces here that we can push back. And so this is why I do systems thinking. I want to give you all some language here about what is systems thinking and really how can it help us, right? You guys are a system as professionals here. You are a regularly interacting group of people who are coming together and forming a whole. So a system is really any the summation of any parts or parts or systems that are coming together and they form a unified whole, right? And so you can see this transportation system. It's a great example, right? It's a system. We have all these different interacting parts. We've got buses, we've got walkers, we've got bikes, and when they come together, they form the transportation system. And then within a system, right, you've got this idea of system thinking, right? Is a really holistic approach to solving problems. We'll talk a little bit about some of this, but really getting at how does the system behave, right? What is biking and buses? How do they interact? And how does the system look, right? And then there's actors in systems, right? And actors play roles, and we've all got a form. We are all actors. You are all actors in the system of design, right? In the system of your community, in the system of your organization. And that's really because we all have a function, right? All systems serve a function, and that function forms out of all of these different dynamics coming together. So what's the function of a transportation system? To move one person or one thing to another area, right? That's the function. And so any part that's coming together and forming a role, we can call it kind of a system. And so don't worry too much about this, but this is a helpful piece for when you're thinking around systems thinking. It helps us to see these small pieces. And it gives us a lot of tools, right? Systems thinking, right? There's so many benefits. Instead of thinking about disconnection, we can look at interconnectedness. Instead of linear, we can look at circular, again, pushing back against mechanistic thinking. Instead of looking at silos, we're really interested in emergence. What happens when we look at all of the pieces, right? What about relationships and connectedness, right? How do we not just analyze, but draw connections and synthesize? And so systems thinking is really just a variety of tools that can help us to understand how we might want to intervene in a problem that's really complex, just like equity is so complex. It's a framework, it helps us, and it's something that's newer that's coming out. And in systems thinking, there's all types of maps. You might have done some mapping. Some of y'all have probably seen a bunch of different maps. These are 4 types of system maps. They're not the only one. But if we think about systems thinking in practice, one of the things I always tell people to do is to start to kind of map systems, a mind map, and just putting what you think you know and putting it out on paper. And this is beautiful because just like any framework, right, there's all kinds of different approaches to systems thinking. This isn't it, right? This is one approach within a model of systems thinking. So this is actually new to me. I did a lot of work thinking about the Earth as a system. And so my work is a very non-white dominant informed idea of systems thinking. But it's great because even these tools, as they help to give us language, right, to describe complex problems, right? So we can start to tell stories and explain to people why we need to divest, defund, abolish the police, and not just call, for justice, for police who have perpetuated violence and murder, right? And so these are great ways to just give us language, to talk about it, so it feels personal and real, and we can kind of wrap our heads around it and start to see. And that's really what the goal is, right? Is to get awareness of the problem. Look at a system, maybe you as designers can go and you see this, you walk into a space and it's like, okay, you can kind of see some stuff that's not working. And so this is all about analysis and critical thinking, which are key to problem awareness, which is hard for our society when we have to stop and analyze, right? Don't get overwhelmed. I just want to show you, this is a causal map. And this is a map of looking at neighborhood social connection and a sense of security. And all they've done is they've taken all these different functions of this system and they've started to map out the relationships, right? And so this is a feedback loop, this is a causal loop. And what we can do is we can start to see the relationship between all of these different pieces. And we don't need to map them, right? But I want you all to think about how great is it if you could look at design and map out all of the inequities and all the opportunities, and you could see the points where you want to intervene. And by doing this, and not necessarily mapping, but by getting problem awareness, by asking questions, they can help us avoid pitfalls, right? And encourage us to think and design for the whole. So I'm going to move through the next slide because I know a lot of people say, what are those arrows? And I always tell people, we're always doing stuff in systems. As designers, when you walk into a space and you're seeing how things are moving, you want to do something, you want to intervene, but you want to make sure that what you're doing, right, is actually going to lead to the type of impact you want to make. So maybe you're implementing an equity initiative and you're saying, we're going to disrupt harm, we're going to stop oppression, but you might actually cause harm in that planning meeting because of your implicit bias. right? And if you don't actually understand equity and go, oh my gosh, I have 400 plus years of unpacking and privilege and work to do, you might actually be a part of perpetuating that harm. And so these are our balancing feedback loops and reinforcing feedback loops. And these are things that systems thinkers can use. And more for you all, I don't expect you all to be a systems thinker. Maybe a few of you all are like, this is my jam, I'm going to go and map everything. But for you all to think about when you're doing an action, what's the impact, right? How do we know that we're being effective? And so one of the tools that I've offered as we start to think about for ourselves as individuals and also for organizations, right, is what does this mean for us? How do we show up? And I'm going to name here that probably in retrospect, I probably could have removed the slides on the system map. So I hope you're giving me grace and not feeling too overwhelmed with it. But again, this idea that we just want to see problems and we want to have language to talk about them and show relationships, right? That's the goal here, is just to ask the question and start to understand. And so for you all, this question is, how do we actually transform systems, right? What does it actually take for us to transform systems? And so there's this really beautiful model from FSG. It's the 6 conditions of systems change. It's what I use for my practice. And systems change is just all about changing the conditions that hold any type of problem in place, right? And so for you all, this means we've got policies and practices, all of these different things, but we've got to do something here for everything. And if we want to really transform the whole system, right? So internal policies, programs and activities, all of these have to shift the way money and information and infrastructure flows, and even our relationships, right? And the power between them, right? Are we working towards quality relationships? Do people have access to decision making? These are all the things that have to shift when we want to change a system, right? If we want to really change all the conditions holding a system in place, these are all the factors that we can look at and start to intervene. And this is a lot for organizations, right? And my offer to you all is that rather than try to change every single factor at once and try to change your policies, and maybe you need to do that as an organization. Maybe you want to update your HR policies, and maybe you want to do a salary analysis to look at resource flows or look at who's getting information. But the most important thing for you all to do, a first step, is to understand the role of mental models, right? Our mental models, the worldviews, the ways of thinking drive the system. They are the center and the most important piece, according to FSG and my work, because we are the actors. We show up, we play roles in all of the system, and how we act, how we speak, how we behave drives the policies we make, the practices we adopt, and reinforce the power dynamics that we have. So all of this, right? When we're mapping systems, when we're looking at systems, we also want to understand what are the beliefs and values that are letting this system move forward. So if you look at a transportation system, it might be that quicker is better, right? Maybe that's not helpful. But for me in the work that I do, it's so important for us to think about mental models driving the system. We are the actors. These are our identities, our beliefs, our worldviews. We bring all of that to work. And so this is hodgepodge of ways of thinking that help to drive the way systems operate, right? And so the work that I've done, right, if we think about values and transformation, is when we start to think about white dominant culture, right? We've got some of these, things here, individualism, urgency, authoritarianism, right? Is we have to kind of put something else in its place. And my offering is that we need to have value-driven culture, right? We need to have something, an answer to white dominant culture. Yes, we must disrupt, we must confront. We also have to build and create and imagine totally different societies, right? And that means we've got to take value-driven action, right? When we combine our values, the things that matter that are bigger than us, with awareness, understanding the problem, right? Reflecting with ourselves, this is how we can actually transform culture, right? And this also helps us to act. How are we going to show up? If we're doing something new, the body's like, I don't know what's happening, right? Our values help us to show how we can show up, right? So instead of white dominant culture, what do we want to cultivate? What do we want our spaces to feel like, right? And this is culture work. This is changing our normative beliefs and our behaviors, and ultimately the mental models that we're bringing into all of the work that we do, right? I'm no longer going to be individualistic. I want to be community-centered. I want to be cooperative and collaborative. And so that's what we're trying to do with this work. I'm going to move past these next two slides because I want to make sure that we make time for questions. But I do a lot of work around consciousness studies and effective allyship. And I've developed my own framework for transformation that's inquiry-based, because I don't want people to keep doing the same thing over and over again. But the point is that old habits die hard. If you want to change your system and your organization, it takes time, probably even years to shift. And we don't want to just do what everyone else is doing, because that's just perpetuating bias, right? We want to have new ways of thinking. And so this transformation process that I have is inquiry-based. And there's a great toolkit that I'll make sure that you all get that talks about awareness and discovery and all these questions that you can ask yourself to make sure you're not just doing the same thing that you did before, right? To do new things, different things that help you, and questions that help you to understand, gosh, what do I seek to understand? How am I accountable? And so this is a framework that's question-based, asking questions to be thinking critically, so that we aren't solving problems with the same level of awareness that created them, right? We need to think above our problems, above our conditioning, to come up with new solutions. And so what does this mean for you all? This is the challenge. And this is my favorite slide, and the last of two slides here as we wrap it up, but this is the challenge. What does it take to be an effective ally, and why is it so, so hard? So do you remember when we talked about that conditioning loop and the ego response and the fear keeping us in there, because we want to be connected. We don't want to be alone. We want friends and community, right? This also creates trauma in the body. Our body reacts. Our body is telling us, be safe, be safe. You know, even though this is really oppressed and you're really like depressed every day and going to your job and sobbing in the elevator before, just keep doing it because it's safe and we know that you're alive and you're going to make it, right? The body would rather do that than go something else, something different, right? So the body is one of the biggest hurdles that we have to overcome. And so my offering to you all, and what I always say, is that we have got to shift from reacting from our body to engaging in what I call the resourceful state. And this is when the ego is disarmed, the heart center is activated, and the prefrontal cortex, the newer part of our brain, is engaged. And that part of our brain has empathy and insight. It can hold complex problems. It can modulate our fear response, and it overwrites our limbic brain, right? The part that's like, oh my gosh, I'm so terrified. What are these people going to think of me in this conference call if I don't have my shirt ironed, or whatever your brain is telling you to freak out about because it wants to keep you safe. And so in all of COVID and death and social uprising and maybe a constitutional crisis, we need the resourceful state to solve the problems. This is unimaginable. It is a victory that all of you are showing up here today. The amount of oppression we face is tremendous. It's astronomical. And you all are doing a phenomenal job just waking up every day and showing up. It's amazing, right? And we've got to maintain this physically in our bodies, emotionally and mentally, even intuitively. We've got to push back when we get triggered to go, oh my gosh, I'm triggered, I'm triggered. Oh, what's the value here? I care. I want to be cooperative. Okay. All right, body, I hear you. Okay, heart, what do you want? What can I do? How can I engage? What question can I ask to engage this part of my brain? And this is essential to make sure that we are disrupting harm and not maintaining the status quo. And the offering to all of you all, which is really the opportunity here, is what happens when you belong to yourself. When you feel like you love yourself, you can bring your whole self to work. This is why I love belonging work. And I want to leave you all with a quote from John Powell. John Powell is the same guy who talked about the othering work, is doing phenomenal work at Berkeley with the Institute for Belonging, I believe. So he's local in California doing virtual lectures. If you love the belonging work, check it out. But belonging is this idea, right, that being fully human means more than having access. It means that we are respected at a very basic level, that we can co-create, make demands upon society, and create more representative solutions and interventions, right? Where we can belong. This is what's available to us. Imagine if your whole self can come to work, if there are spaces where we're leading with our values, where you can come and where you're encouraged to bring your whole self and where you feel like you belong. Imagine how good that will feel in your body to bring all of you, all of your identities, all of your excitement there. And even workplaces that are cultivating belonging, where we're setting ourselves up for creating resourceful states for employees. Imagine that if you walk into your workplace and you don't have to hold the tension, but instead you can connect with your deepest excitement and the creative intelligence that is accessible to you. And this is my offering to you all, and my hope that you all will think about these complex issues, but think about the opportunity. And when we ask deep questions, when we center ourselves, when we disrupt the ego, when we lead with values, we create opportunities where everyone can really belong. So that's it. Thank you all. And I know we went a little over with time. I know people have a lot of questions, so I hope you all will give me your grace. But I'm going to pause there and hand it over to our tech support to provide some guidance on the Q&A section. And I'm also on LinkedIn and around too if folks have questions.
Alexis, I'm right here, actually.
Hi. Hello. Hello.
That was so good. So much unpacking to do. We have one question so far. If you please type in your questions if you have more, but it's a great question and it is a doozy. So here we go. From Megan Reed. Oftentimes people aren't willing to interface with Jedi conversations because they believe it will be inherently political. How do we, especially young people whose progressiveness might be dismissed as a phase, bring up these concerns within our organizations without being immediately shut down on the basis of keeping politics out of school, work, etc.?
Megan, asking the tough questions here. Wow, this is really tough. Yeah, I would ask is, this spectrum, your organization might not be on the spectrum. There's the history and the culture, and not everyone is able to receive this. I'm sure there's probably people on this call, and I shared this with Verdes. I hope that if there's one or two people who leave and go, I got it, I get it, or I had my aha, or had a shift, not everyone is ready for this message. They might have trauma, they might have whatever, they might be fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And so it's a process, right? You have to do a lot of work, and it depends on your window of comfortability in doing that work. To continue to push, and I would invite you to think about how can you ask questions or bring up these topics in a way that's going to keep your organization in a resourceful state. I want to say that, but also offer that sometimes you just need to say things. You need to disrupt harm and let people know. But if you're just trying to bring this into your workplace and you know that people are really hesitant about it, can you tell me why? Ask questions, engage them, ask them. Sometimes it's a matter of looking at research, looking at what other practitioners are doing, seeing how you might look at other problems within the organization. But sometimes, right, if people aren't willing to interface with Jedi conversations, save your energy for people who are asking questions, right? It's hard to answer this, but I always tell people, like, not everyone is willing to hear what you need to say. And so sometimes it's like, you got to take that conversation somewhere else, and you have to decide, right? Maybe this isn't a place for you if you want to have these conversations, or maybe you feel so excited about the work that you will connect with your resourceful state and start to think, okay, how might I engage my staff? How might I bring up these conversations? One thing I will say is you probably have allies at your workspace. So maybe ask and say, hey, maybe there's a way that we can just create some space. Employee resource groups are one great way to have a community of people. There's probably allies. Find your allies, find ways to talk about with people so you're not in it alone. Ideally, also, you can find people who are allies who are in management positions and have a little bit more leverage. Sometimes they'll be more open to hearing feedback because of the power dynamic. And this is a lot of managing up. This is emotional labor if you're not getting paid for it. So I want to honor that. You have to do it within your means, but asking questions, finding allies, sharing information, and kind of finding good ways to confront and keep seeding it, knowing that at some point, people are going to open up and want to talk about some of these issues. So Megan, I hope that helps you out, and I hope that you keep having these conversations and asking how you can push this at work.
There's a follow-up question to that, and a question really early on about wanting to know more about allies versus accomplices. And this question here is from Kendra. How do we know someone is trying to be an ally, especially in experiencing reverse and seen reverse practices at times? Want so much better to be an ally. I want so much better allyship.
Yeah, if you're new to this journey as an ally, like you're going to mess up. You're going to do performative stuff. Like it's, and like people will probably maybe say mean things on your Twitter page and stuff, but you kind of have to just go, okay, thank you for your feedback. I'm learning. I want to do better, and just double down on your commitment to do it. Sometimes allyship can feel performative or doesn't feel really thoughtful. And so that's why, when people release statements, I'm like, great, release a statement. But if you're going to release a statement, like have a follow-up, right? Have a plan. And so I think accomplice in this shift, and I actually took a slide out because I was trying to pare this down, is asking for and making sure you listen and hear what the needs are of the community or group or movement you're supporting. And so being an accomplice is also being a thought partner, recognizing and honoring your privilege, and then letting people lead and tell you how you show up and honoring their autonomy, right? And this is in an equity justice frame. So I think that's one piece that's helpful, is not just saying like, oh, I'm anti-racist, I believe Black Lives Matter, right? It's an active practice. And I think the accomplice piece really gets at that. You're showing up, you're putting in the work, you're responding to racist LinkedIn messages or Twitter pages, or confronting, your racist uncle or whatever it is. Hope that helps. And there's some wonderful articles about being an accomplice versus an ally.
Somebody was hoping for an example of good allyship.
Ooh. Okay, you're in a meeting. Someone's really nervous, and they're kind of maybe fumbling with words, but they've got great ideas, and maybe they came to you and pitched this whole idea, and maybe someone is interrupting them, and maybe you're noticing that there is maybe a dimension of privilege or power because someone is maybe senior, or maybe a white male, or maybe toxic. And so a simple way would be to say, excuse me, I just want to interrupt because I feel like there's a dynamic that's playing out here that's actually not, serving this individual. And I really just want to make sure that we give this person who worked really hard the space to share. Please continue. And I always try to say, don't apologize. You can just say, oh, excuse me, ally here. There's different approaches to it, but I think just naming it, not necessarily apologizing, but cutting it off and then recentering whoever the person is and giving them space to continue showing up in a way that's real for them. And that can look like a lot of different things, but probably speaking up is I think that very basic thing where we all have the opportunity to show up as an ally.
All right, another question here. Hi, Alexis. Once a company has formed their DEI group and rolled out their implicit bias training, how do you recommend that they continue learning and opening their minds towards inclusiveness? Do you have examples of companies who are doing this successfully?
Oh, let's see here. Well, there's a whole, it's kind of hard, right? I could tell you, okay, here's your next step. But I would say probably the most important thing is to make sure you've got a value statement in place, to make sure that, okay, they've done the training, keep doing the training, get a budget for training, think about those 6 conditions for change. Those are some of all the opportunities, right, of how they can move towards inclusiveness. So the DEI group, the training, that's working on mental models, right? That's one of the conditions of change. They can look at their practices, right? The programs, the initiatives. Maybe they do a learning series with employees, right? Maybe they talk about resource and information flows, and maybe there's a panel discussion centering voices of color, or those who identify as transgender, or those who have chronic illnesses, or whatever. Some companies who are doing this great, Ben and Jerry's. I'm still a little bit mad about them for some of the materials that the glyphosate, but listen, they're doing great. They're coming with receipts. They literally had when they had the statement for George Floyd, they were like, as we said years ago. So they're doing great work. They've got solid language and a great framework. I also want to go ahead and glow up a couple of the clients I work with because I do value aligned work. I would encourage you all to reach out to Studio O+A. They're going on this journey. They went through a little mini journey with me and are asking some of these deep questions. But they've taken a really great approach by finding frameworks. Do the research. One training is not going to do 400 years of oppression and your body conditioning. Keep doing that. create employee resource groups, create masterminds, create a peer system, some type of space at work where you can keep learning. And then as you do that, you'll get frameworks or methodologies, and you'll say, oh, look at what this thought leader is doing. This is great. This really aligns with our organization. And that can help you to think about next steps. And ideally, right, that will support the strategic plan that you have, and it'll be kind of integrated into that work. Also, Exposure Labs is another client that I work with. They just dropped the social dilemma out there, and they're doing fantastic work around this and asking really deep questions. They've got their value statement and stuff that's posting and coming on their website in great language there as well. So I'm going to glow them up a little bit.
Do we have time for 2 more questions?
I'm good. I'm here.
Okay. Let's see. This one I'm not quite sure I understand. Do you engage with coworkers that think inequity and racism does not exist since they have personally not experienced it as a person of color? Do you think training can help change that point of view?
Yeah, I mean, I left the workplace because I was one of those super sensitive people that was like, this is not okay. How we can't talk to each other this way. And mine wasn't even about like racism. And I remember a couple of times trying to engage, and I was like, oh, this people aren't here for it. And I think it's an individual decision. There are people who have the emotional capacity and the strength to continue to confront and disrupt. For other people, it might look different. It might be different. It might be handing out flyers or just offering and saying, hey, we're doing this book club on this. Do you want to come? And just opening. But it's within your window of tolerance. If you're dealing with anxiety, if you're dealing with grief and stress, don't talk to those coworkers. Like, work on yourself. That's an act of liberation. That's just as important as confronting and disrupting people, I think. Some people might be different, but I do really think that healing your own trauma, taking care of yourself is going to help you to stop creating harm. So it's really up to you. I do think training can help, but it's got to be over and over again, and they have to be willing, right? If your coworkers are saying it doesn't exist, right? Probably this is a language that they picked up from TV or something, or they were born into it, right? If they're not in the resourceful state, they're really not going to, they're not going to be able to receive what you have to say. And so I always say, where can you put your energy and attention where it's going to be received, right? So training can help, but you've got to do multiple trainings over and over and over again. It's an ongoing process.
That's a great answer. Put on your own mask first, right? Okay, last question, I think, and it's a good one to end with. So, and this is from Edward. Hi, Edward. How are you doing down in Southern Cal? It's so great to see people from Northern California and Seattle, Orange County, Chicago today. It's been great. All right, great job, Alexis. So much to absorb. We have a newly formed D&I committee for our company. What suggestions would you recommend are the best first steps to set effective and realistic goals to show movement in equality?
Ooh, okay. So I'll tell you some possible next steps, but I want to encourage you all that the next step that you all need is available to you all, and you just have to ask the right questions and give you all space. So I'm going to offer you what some other people have done, but again, we got to get into the space where we can kind of answer our own questions, and we might fail or fumble, but we learn. And maybe you don't have time to fail and fumble, but make sure that group that you come together, that you all have clearly articulated. Why are we coming together? What is our mission or our purpose, right? What are our roles and responsibilities? Who's going to lead? Who's going to do what? How do we hold ourselves accountable? Are there community agreements or things that we all want to agree to for how we're going to operate? Ideally, those are values, or they iterate the values of your organization so that when stuff comes up, we aren't pointing at people. I think white dominant culture says, oh, you messed up, you're wrong. And that's, again, like keeping tabs in authoritarianism. Instead, we want to go, oh gosh, where was there a breakdown in the process or the structure? And so if you have a plan, 1 page, bullet points, it could be pictures. Don't think too much about it if you don't have time, and this is volunteer. Get really clear about why you're coming together, what you all hope to do, and then you can start to think about, great. And that takes consensus building. So you can survey, you can ask questions, but ask what people want to do. Write it down, and then start to develop the theory of change. Do research, look at frameworks. Be like, okay, if we're here and we're coming together because, being an anti-racist organization is important, then we believe that by doing X, Y, and Z, we're going to do X, Y, and Z, and then go test it, and then write it down and go back and say, how did we do? Did our intent max our impact, you know? But get that plan in place to know how you all are working together and the roles and how you're going to work together, so that if things get sticky, you don't blame each other. You can go back, okay, let's revisit our plan. What are we learning here? Ask a question. Well, how should we update our work plan? What are we learning here, so that we can shift and move together as a group?
Great. Okay, we're gonna wrap this up. And you know, I forgot to introduce myself. I just assumed everybody knew who I was. I am your president-elect, coming up on the heels of Yoko. Yoko has been is a wonderful mentor, and I'm learning so much. And I'm looking forward to leading IIDA Northern California next year. And I have quite an agenda, which mirrors very closely Alexis's presentation. She asked the question, how do we give back more? And we are in a climate, a justice, and a biodiversity. That's my train. I'm gonna start over. We are in a climate, a justice, and a biodiversity emergency, and we have to do more now. And that question is imperative. How do we give back more? And I hope you guys will all consider that. This committee would love to hear from you. And if you have more questions for Alexis, we can try to see if we can get those answered, and what you thought of this and what you would like to see next. We would love to hear from you. You can get to us through the IIDA website. All of our emails are on that site. Thank you. Are you good, Alexis?
I'm so great. I'm having that moment after you present, and then your body's like, it's really my body responding, going, you did it. You don't have to freak out. You did it like pretty okay. So I'm just grateful and feeling happy that from the chat and all the people who shared their thoughts and are thinking deeply about this, and gratitude to be invited into your space. So I feel great, and I'm just thank you to the North California chapter for having me here.
Thank you so much for sharing all of your knowledge with us, and we look forward to doing more and giving back more. Okay, we're gonna leave. You guys can all start to sign off. We're gonna leave this open for a few more minutes, and we will have this on the website. It'll take us a few weeks to get there, but eventually this will be on there, available for you to review. It's a lot to unpack. Thanks, guys. Bye. Have a good evening. Thanks to everyone who attended. Thank you.